Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your co-host. Happy Saturday. This is Enslaved, Washington, D.C. with our good friend Edward joining us once again. Edward, I'm going to keep the introduction short so you can maximize your time and turn it over to you. Take as long as you need, and we'll look forward to hearing your comments. If anyone has any questions or comments and you're watching us live, feel free to type those in the Zoom chat or the Q&A.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Robert, are you picking this up?
I am.
Good, thank you. We'll continue. First, I want to thank Robert and DC Culture and History for making this good work possible. And I also want to put what we're doing this afternoon into a world perspective as we approach the one, I hate to call it an anniversary, but the date on which one sovereign country was invaded by another one. I want to put that into perspective. And I also want to mention, keep in mind the situation in Syria and Turkey, that we live in a world that is connected. And however we practice works of, I don't want to call them charity or grace or whatever word we want to use, being here is certainly a step in a direction. There are other things to think about as well. With that, I'd like to pause just for a moment. And again, everyone, thank you. My name is Ed Ingebretsen, and I again always thank Robert and his help in putting out programs like this. Robert has been very gracious with putting forward an avenue for learning adults to actually learn more about the world that we live in. I've been a resident in Washington, D.C. since 1986, when I started at Georgetown University. The program today is called Enslaved, Washington, D.C., 1790 to 2023, actually. And it's called Unscrubbing a History. What do we mean by that? Let me see if I can move this along. The District of Columbia, the federal city, was created to demonstrate the political might of the new nation's slaver powers. Harsh language, but true. The location was a compromise between North and South over war debt and the power of slavery or enslavement. This afternoon's examination of the laws and the practices, social customs, and persons that make the federal city is part of a wider project that I do, examining Anglo-colonial enslavement practices and white race apartheid. I've had the privilege of working with some folks on this, and I thank you for joining me in those. Enslaved Washington, D.C., 1790, 2023, is actually intended to be a walking tour of the district, which I do. Much of what we were saying this afternoon, when I started that, was created to demonstrate the political might of the new nation's slaver power. You would not know that from walking in DC. One of the reasons I talk about unscrubbing the history. Georgetown Harbor and Alexandria Harbor. Let's just start. Georgetown Harbor began as a Maryland tobacco port in 1751. Now you'll notice already that is 40 years earlier than 1790, which is technically the date the city becomes a territory, making it the oldest neighborhood in Washington, D.C. I regret this afternoon that I cannot spend a lot of time on the specifics of enslaved Georgetown. It's a different program, and I do that one. Alexandria Harbor, 1745, an act appointing several new ferries on the Potomac River. These two harbors will be central to what it is that we're looking at this afternoon. As I started with Ukraine and also Turkey and Syria, cultures are structures. They're not feelings, they're materials, they're words, they're actions or lack of actions, they're habits. Cultures absorb memory as stones absorb heat. Cultures have a gravitational weight. History casts shadows. As we walk through our lives, we walk in patterned light and dark. This is a partial look at the shadows cast by our federal city. The slave pit and the auction block on O Street, Senator John Kennedy's home in Georgetown, bought with a segregationist certification on it. The enslaved remains throughout Georgetown that we still find. Howard University, the first act of reparation by the federal government. Miller's Tavern, a slaver tavern. DC Blue Jug City Prison, where slavers would go if they needed enslaved persons and simply take the prisoners. Roby's Slave Pen, and those who are in DC know this as the building across the street from the Hirshhorn. Beatty's Auction Block in Georgetown, what is now the Georgetown Theater building. Washington Memorial, the White House, enslaved built. Thomas Jefferson, who owned himself through his life over 600 enslaved persons who could not be freed, and these are including his own children, but who could not be freed because they mortgaged the building of Monticello. And after his death, they're put up for auction. Who knows any of this? Are there any markers on Georgetown streets? Are there any markers at the Federal District? The work of memory has been silenced in a lot of these respects. Whether about the contraband camps, Georgetown Harbor, it's axiomatic. Soft power is a congratulatory. The demeaning methods were used to elevate those who lack material power. Women who might be listening this afternoon understand it because we do as men, do soft power to women all the time. We open doors, we do not do justice. So that kind of lauding somebody for their culture or their music or their whatever it is that we claim that they are bringing to us, we flatter our greatness. And so lauding DC as, quote, the Black cultural capital of the United States, and which is actually, you can find this in most of the encyclopedias and works around District of Columbia. So my presentation is not about soft power. It's not about a certain kind of person's music. It's not about a certain kind of person's cultural gumbo and divide. It's just certainly not about how they make our lives more comfortable. It's about how, in fact, Washington, D.C. still moves in chains, enslaved and powerless, the citizens of all ethnicities without representation still. DC is larger than 3 other states. We still do not have representation. There are no surprises here because this is the power of commodity slave power and the display of that power that the federal city was founded to be in 1790. It's a compromise in which slave power compromised nothing. One example of how history remains literally whitewashed. 1, most DC history is scrubbed, erasing the legal and de facto segregation and apartheid that existed in DC and flattering Black residents by awarding them a cultural sensitivity, soft power. We all go down to U Street to celebrate Black music, to celebrate the Chili Bowl. Even President Obama went there. The streets remain unmarked. We are still digging up Black citizens, and they were citizens, from our streets unmarked. 2, segregation is a euphemism for a hierarchized apartheid structured society. And let me be clear, apartheid here was not meant to keep Black people. It was meant to keep white people. 3, the forgotten because washed and whitened fact. DC's segregated schools were one of the 5 cases that went to the Supreme Court in 1954. Who knows that? Segregation in Washington, D.C. was a glaring example of the contradiction in American society up until 2022-23. In the 1950s, the city's government, schools, were under the control of Congress. Congress could have passed laws to desegregate it. It did not. It could have passed laws to give us representation. It did not. It could have passed laws to give us simply the right to vote. It did not until we passed an amendment in 1961. Its members proudly portrayed the city as the capital of the free world, where democracy and personal freedoms were defended against the threat of communist totalitarianism. Yet most of the city's public facilities, schools, and housing were segregated by law and by practice. Enslaved Africans, quote, I'm using that expression because they were at the time African, were 25% of the federal city's population in 1800. The labor was specifically designated by Congress, quote, to build the federal city as inexpensively as possible. No news here, right? So these and their children born here will also be the first Black American citizens. They are not African American, they are Black American. The area of construction derived a name, quote, Congo of America, from this initial population of enslaved persons dragged, shipped by duress from one country to another, who surveyed, dug, transported stone, built the city in the 10-year period allotted by Congress. These persons were then, and their descendants continue to be effectively stateless. Although by right of birth and law, they are not African, they are American born, and I repeat that. Life without representation continues in DC, and it is purposeful. A word in my politic and my practice, you can kind of hear it as I talk. I don't use the word African American unless I say, for example, of myself, I'm a European American. African refers to a person taken under duress from another country. Black American is a person enslaved or free, born in the US, kept under duress as a commodity and a property. Uncle Tom's Cabin, the subtitle of this by Louisa May Alcott, The Man Who Was the Thing. Lincoln said to her, so you're the woman who wrote the book, The Start of this Great Big War, the Civil War. By 1800, a great majority of enslaved were therefore American, most of them. So origins of the federal city, 1790, 1799, and you heard at the very beginning just a bit of music from Hamilton. If you know Hamilton, the narrative around Hamilton, well, you'll have a sense of where you are. But before I want to start here, I want to acknowledge to paraphrase something that Robert Frost said at Kennedy's inauguration. He said the land was ours before we were the land's. Frost is incorrect in this point, and he should know better as a New Englander. I begin by acknowledging the weight of colonizing history carried by the native peoples now lost to the federal city. And the different markers, you can see the groupings of different persons. I want to be in the room where it happens, the art of the compromise. Hold your nose and close your eyes. We want our leaders to save the day, but we don't want to get a say in what they trade away. No one really knows how the parties got to yes in the capital decision. The pieces that are sacrificed in every game of chess. The skin in the game? Well, actually, we do know the skin in the game. It was not ours. But when the North gave away, what did they give away? And what did they give away to the South? They gave to the South this. Two places, Maryland and Virginia. They would both become colonies, enslaved colonies, with two harbors, Georgetown and Alexandria. The Resident Act of 1790 ordered the move of the federal government from first New York and then Philadelphia. Fascinating stories in and of itself, because it was moved from Philadelphia because the North didn't have the money to pay the war debt, the revolution. And the South said, you know what, we'll pay it, but we're going to pay it if you move the capital from the North to the South. So you have two basically areas of swamp here that become the capital. The important thing is this is Southern territory. It's a show of slaver power, to quote Mr. Obama, because they could. The move was a result of a financial crisis and an anxious Congress worried about their safety in Philadelphia. The reason that Congress still has, and we saw this in 2020, on January 6th, the reason that the Congress has its own kind of area, because it couldn't guarantee that there would be other persons who would help them when they needed it. We're going to move quickly over here. This was the Congress's first map of the original city as it was laid out. We're going to talk a little bit about George Washington. I don't get much time to think about this, but Washington's self-interested choices. Remember that he and Jefferson both have plantations within rock's throw of the river. Both of them were entrepreneurs. Washington sold flour. Jefferson sold, how do I say it politely, product called people. Washington's self-interested choices in locating the new government in a place near his plantation, where starting in 1797, he began creating and shipping liquor to Europe. Here, for example, is a mural at Washington High School in San Francisco And you can see even then the politics, you can see the indigenous persons, you can see the colonials, you can see the soldiers. You can see somewhere in his picture, you can see Banneker, the black enslaved person who was actually the person who was the architect. But all these persons here being directed by Washington. Here you have the map as we have it of Washington. Looking ahead, a question of why does the District of Columbia have this particular shape? Now you begin to see it here if you've never thought about it. Because in 1846, what we call the retrocession of Alexandria, Alexandria was the center for the buying and selling of enslaved persons in 1746. For 50 years, its major product in Virginia, and any economist will tell you this, was the buying and selling, not of tobacco, not of cotton, but of Black Americans' bodies, male, female, and children. We'll see that as we come to it. Alexandria became clear that the District of Columbia was going to give over buying and selling, or the trade, quote, in enslaved persons in the district. It wasn't ending the sale. It wasn't ending enslavement, it was ending the sale. And Alexandria said, no, we can't do that because this is our lifeline. So, which is why we have the district with that actual shape of memory. So when we see that, remember what you are not seeing when you see that shape. You can still find the border stones. This is in Virginia, off the river. This is in Virginia. Okay. Washington, D.C. was called the slave market of America. And this was a broadside during 1835 and 1836. And we won't have time to go through a lot of it today, but some of these images we will begin to see as we go through it. So, but I want to pause here just to make another particular point. We hear much talk about the first enslaved persons in Virginia in 1619. Unfortunately, that's not correct, really. Already enslaved persons, Black as well as indigenous, had been taken from 1495, and the first enslaved persons through Spain had come into the near the South Georgia, South Carolina border in 1526. So while this is an interesting and a good date to think about, we need to think of the 126-year history of enslavement already in the colonies and this particular area, not necessarily by our particular colonialists, but by starting with Columbus and the people that came before that. And Indian slavery, indigenous American slavery, continued until 1880 throughout the colonies and the South. So what history teaches? That the buying and selling of enslaved Black Americans was the reason for the federal city's location. In Carry Me Back, Stephen Doyle writes, Virginia's, quote, entire economy was based on the institution of chattel slavery. Eric Williams, Capital and Slavery in 1942. Negro slaves, and I say 1942 because this is almost, about 80, 90 years ago. This is not new information. Negro slaves, 1/20th of the population in 1670, were 1/4 in 1730. Slavery, from being an insignificant factor in the economic life of the colony, Virginia, had become the very foundation upon which it was established. There was still room in Virginia, as there was not in Barbados, for the small farmer, but land was useless to him if he could not compete with slave power. And I apologize that we can't go through into more detail, and this is simply a walkthrough. I'm very happy afterwards to direct folks to good bibliographies and where to do this work. Unfortunately, to say something I've said before, much of this work, while it's not quite exactly hidden, one is discouraged from finding it. 2 texts, Carry Me Back. Carry Me Back to Old Virginia is the title of the song. And you're going to wonder, I'm going to ask later, why is it that the state song of a colony, of a state, would be a minstrel song sung by a Black old enslaved person? Who would do that? From the founding of the federal city, beginning with the capitalist move in 1800, human enslavement was legal in Washington, D.C. See the map. With its proximity to both the upper and lower South, the district would become a major center for the buying and selling of human people, passing thousands of enslaved Blacks a year through the plantations of the Deep South. The trade went north as well, only in different forms. Just to be clear, from 1790 until 1800, more than 1 million enslaved Black Americans moved through the District of Columbia, or as they call it then, the Territory of Columbia. That's a fact. Over 1 million enslaved persons, male and female and children, were walked through, usually, from the north to the south to the north, Washington, D.C., and D.C.'s itself, its own enterprise, its own commerce, its own commodity was profited from this. Nowhere to this day does one find markings in the district that acknowledge this, except in the most vague way. And although the power Congress had to outlaw enslavement in the district, it did not do so until 1862. And the power of the pro-slavery forces was too strong. They passed a gag rule in 1936. Congress said that any law that comes up, any petition that comes up about slavery or enslavement, we will not hear it. This was the rule of Congress in 1836. Sorry. Capitalism and slavery, a gruesome stew of greed, racism, and brutality, helped create a substantial interstate slave trade by 1812. Again, this is a 1942 book. This is not new information. Purchased lives, the American slave trade from 1808 to 1865. Why 1808? Because in 1808, the president then, Jefferson, disbanded the intercontinental trade of enslaved persons. Again, to quote Mr. Obama, because he could, because he understood, and I'll give you the data as we come forward, that as a matter of fact, Virginia and Maryland were now in a position of producing their own product. The domestic buying and selling of Black persons in the US greatly surpassed in volume the original numbers of people transported directly to the colonies. Repeat, the domestic buying and selling of Black persons up and down, north and south, up to over 1 million, greatly surpassed in volume the original numbers of people transported directly to the colonies, which is, most theorists say is probably about 500 to 600,000 of the 12 million persons who, most of whom went to the South America. Though Congress outlawed the importation of kidnapped enslaved persons, the slave population in the US nearly tripled over the next 50 years. Fact, in 1790, there were 700,000 enslaved persons in the new nation. Fact, by 1860, according to the census, there were 4 million enslaved persons, from 700,000 to 4 million. And this, by constitution, to a technology or an economy that was, quote, fading away, enslavement. So the domestic buying and selling of these stateless persons, by domestic, not a good word, I can't think of a different word, but the interstate buying and selling of these stateless persons within the US continued into the 1860s and beyond. It removed by force approximately 1.2 million men, women, and children from home and family, the great majority of which passed through the train systems, the cargo systems, and the canal systems of Washington, D.C. The vast majority of these persons were born in the United States after the last importation of African captives. They would have been American. By 1850, most, probably all, U.S. enslaved persons were third, fourth, or fifth generation Americans. Their typical ad, just received from Virginia and Middle Tennessee, sorry. 1857 edition of the Memphis Daily Appeal. See how close already we are to the Civil War. Just received from Virginia and Middle Tennessee a likely yacht of young Negroes consisting of field hands, house servants, and number one cook and general house servant. If one reads the newspapers of the times, one sees the word a likely, and the reason that they capitalize that here, likely is kind of a code word, usually having the sense of a certain kind of personality. It's not whether we like them or not. There's a certain code, and I don't want to go into it at this particular point, except that it was providing a clue for the persons who would purchase these persons. All right, some details here. I already talked about this. In the 1840s, 300,000 enslaved persons came through Washington, D.C. south. During each decade between 1810 and 1860, 100,000 enslaved persons were removed and came through the South. In the final decade alone, that is to say, in the 1850s, 350,000 lives were destroyed. All these people in bondage were born, raised, and died in the United States. I repeat that because it's worth repeating. They were citizens in every way except legal caste. You see here the kind of the increase in enslaved populations in the lower South. And again, remember that one of the reasons that the North, quote, gave into the South on enslavement was because it was designed, of course, to fade away. Well, you see how that particular works. And a coming slide that you will see here in a moment, many of these enslaved persons were moved this way because, as Thomas Jefferson will point out, the reason he got New Orleans is because they needed a place to sell their product. Again, this is not exactly a lecture on economics, but the Wild West and the war between Texas, this was a show of slaver power. They were extending slaver power and rights. Here, if you're more visually oriented, you can see the greater number of enslaved persons. And I say here, the beginnings of Wall Street. Slavery, quote, formed the basis of the economic life of New England. About it revolved, and so depended most of our other industries. Lorenzo Green, 1942. How the North promoted, prolonged, and profited from slavery complicity. It's a point to make this because whenever we hear about this, we always say, well, it's the Southern problem, and the North has nothing to do with it. I do this walking tour around the Washington Gallery and near the Mellon Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation, which gave money to the National Gallery to be built there, is part of where this comes from. But as you look at this, the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, from 1834 to 1858, they over double, as does the U.S. population of enslavement. Remember that the first law permitting and legalizing enslaved is Massachusetts in 1641. The stock market, 1711. You can still see the sign. Law appointing a place for the more convenient hiring of slaves, be it ordained by the mayor, recorder, alderman, assistants of the city of New York convened in common council, and it is thereby ordained by the authority of the same that all Negro and Indian slaves, wait, what? And Indian slaves? Not a word that this is unusual, because it's not. My point, to repeat again, is most of the history of indigenous enslavement is simply erased. That are let out to hire within the city do take up their standing in order to be hired at the market house at the Wall Street slip until such time, whereby all persons may know where to hire slaves as their occasion shall require, and also masters discover when their slaves are so hired. The point here is that the North did not have the kind of agricultural need for enslavement, but they did find other ways of using their slaves. So not to let it be said that that enslavement was not unknown in the North, because it was known in the North, and they were using this as they did in Congress. They rented their enslaved persons, as George Washington did, for example, as Jefferson did, for example. George Washington's slaves built the Smithsonian, built Decatur House. These are persons who were making money off the enslaved work of their people. This is an important map, and we don't have, again, a lot of time we won't spend on it. This is the area of Oklahoma. These are where what they call the six civilized tribes of Cherokee lived in Georgia. And by the 1830s, with Andrew Jackson, who was known as the Indian Killer, which is how he became president, said he was clearing out all the indigenous persons over here, even though we had contracts with them, we had legal trades. Why was that? Because they discovered that this land would be suitable for cotton, raising cotton. So they transported these persons here into Oklahoma. And you may recall the Supreme Court had something to say about this just 2 years ago. So we will come to that. In fact, we'll come to it right now. So Andrew Jackson's politics, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, they're not just a historical problem from some years ago. Neil Gorsuch writes in his majority opinion, he just had no sooner become a Supreme Court. Today, we asked whether the land these treaties promised remains an Indian reservation for purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word. Washington Post, 2020, Supreme Court rules that about half of Oklahoma is Native American land. To back up to where I started, the culture in which we walk, we still carry its shadows. And however we try to, don't say gay, don't say black, don't say this, don't say that, however we can say it, we still walk and move in a state and land where the silenced history will speak out. Price and Birch and Company on Duke Street, 1315 Duke Street in Alexandria, the most notorious slaver pens in certainly in Virginia. Franklin and Armfield leased this building in 1828 as a holding pen for enslaved people, Black people, being shipped from Northern Virginia to Louisiana. And some of which, as you may know, and we don't have much time today to talk about it, even Georgetown University was part of that particular trade. And while they're doing the work to recompense for that, it was still part of what happened. By the 1830s, the slavers sold 1,000 Black people annually, operating one of the largest slave trading companies in the United States until 1836. It was continually owned by slavers until 1861. This is one of the very earliest photographs. You can see the soldiers inside of it. This is the back off-street view. More soldiers, Matthew Brady. As many as 1 million people are thought to have passed through the district between 1828 and 1861. And it's important for those who know the district of the territory of Columbia to ask yourself, where would they have been? Because you know it's not a very large particular space. Franklin Armfield's ad, cash for 500 Negroes. Now, again, one sees here that we're not simply, the excuse was often made in Washington, well, but there are domestic servants and they take care of our families. 500, including both sexes from 12 to 25 years of age. Persons having likely servants, there's the word again, to dispose of, will find it to their interest to give us a call, as we will give higher prices in cash. Interesting. What year is this? It's 1860 perhaps. So what other option might there be? We give higher prices in cash than any other purchaser who is now or may who after come into this market. Bill Keeling, male, age 11, 4.5 feet. Elizabeth, female, 10. Monroe, 12, 4'7". Lovey, 10, 3'10". Robert, male, age 12, 4'4". Mary Fitch, age 11, 4'11". What kind of culture have we produced in which this is possible? (1857). Horses, mules, and dark African niggers inscribed on this collar. Franklin, Summers, and Cumberland, 1857. This is not so long ago. Barbed wire collar used to domesticate animal or enslaved human, 1840. The slavers were careful. They understood where the DC line was, here. and stayed on it. My earlier question, carrying me back to old Virginia. In what kind of culture is it appropriate for a governor to dress up in blackface? This is in medical school. In what kind of culture is it appropriate? The state song is the minstrel being sung by an enslaved, elderly Black who clearly will not have Social Security, who clearly does not have safety net, who clearly Rick Scott and his sundowning of these sorts of things doesn't affect this particular person because he didn't have it to begin with. Much of this passes beyond our recognition because we just don't see it. The weight and power of words. Sticks and stones will not hurt us, we say. But actually, it's the sticks and stones that do the damage, as we'll see. Presidents and laws who enslave. Why the federal city was moved from New York to Georgetown Harbor. Enslavement ends with change. It does not begin with them. Words begin the work. Words are weapons and enforce power. Pay attention to what's happening in the news ourselves in our own particular country, and we see that. One, prior to the Civil War, protected by the US Constitution, 8 serving presidents owned enslaved persons and brought them to the White House. That is to say, all of them. 2, providing wealth for the white elite North as well as South. Remember that the Northern industry, AIG, Bank of America, Northern schools, starting with Brown, starting with Harvard, starting with Georgetown, starting with Dartmouth, you can go down the list. Approximately 1 in 4 Southern families held enslaved persons prior to the Civil War. The question then again remains, something that Karl Marx once remarked, he says, you know what, it's not the power of a culture's economies that prove its strength, but how it gets the persons who have no investment in the culture at all to keep it up. If only 1 in 4 families held enslaved persons, how all these numbers of years did it keep on going? You look at the culture now and you see who's voting for what. One wonders, what do these people get by voting this particular way? Words of power protected. According to the 1860 US Census, there were 385,000 slave owners out of a white population of 7 million. We'll repeat that, 385 enslavement owners out of a white population of 7 million. And yet who paid the burden of going to battle? This is the work the words do. For 50 of the 72 years between the elections of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, a slaveholder was president of the US. During that period, only a slave keeper would be a 2-term president. 12 of the first 18 presidents enslaved Black people at some point in their lives. 9 brought enslaved people as property into the White House. Jackson had them in what we would now call the diplomatic room, polishing his silver. Let's not talk about Lafayette Park, which was the center of American enslavement in terms of auctions and even a graveyard. We don't have much time today to address that. We'll look at it quickly. A majority of the founders of the United States enslaved people. 41 of the 56 signatories of the Declaration, 25 of the 55 men, and they were men, who wrote the US Constitution. Had I the time, I could say their names. George Washington wrote to a friend and said, I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery. Well, maybe. Yet Washington owned slaves his entire life, beginning at age 11. His standard shot of him and his quote, his servant, who's in the dark, and of course, Washington is in the light. Here's Banneker, who was the architect for the district. He's holding George Washington's horse. By the way, remind me sometime to tell you where George Washington got his teeth. You may know this story. You can Google it. The curious case of Thomas Jefferson, slaver, founder, guilty author of the Declaration, first Secretary of State, architect of the federal city, And also, he actually put a proposal in for the White House, which thankfully didn't pass. We'll see. And who was Sally Hemings, a slave child? She was. He fathered 5, maybe 6 enslaved children, whom he never acknowledged nor legally freed. Whom he never acknowledged nor legally freed. This is the man who was so good with words. This is the man who talked about individual rights and that all men are created equal, who was accompanied while he was writing this by Madison, who was getting him his tea. He has one woman in the kitchen who's working for him. He has another woman, Sally, who is in a room, as we'll see. So Jefferson has iconic status as the author of the most sacred document, the Declaration of Independence. Yet nothing is more certain than that Jefferson did not intend that Black people should remain in America as free citizens. Right? Do we know this? He did not intend that Black people should remain in America as free citizens. In fact, he says they couldn't be freed. We'll talk to that in a moment. In 2017, archaeologists conducted excavations as part of a restoration on Monticello. They discover down the hall behind the wall of Jefferson's chambers, they find this room that supports the rumors that it's swirling around the president for centuries. This is where Sally Hemings, I don't know how else to say this, was kept. So we've all been in this place, both symbolically, materially, physically. A solemn monument to a man who neither believed nor practiced what the monument says. That should not surprise us when we consider the other monuments we have. The Jefferson Memorial, panel 3. You guys can see this also yourselves. It offers a quotation from his autobiography. However, it edits Jefferson on this point, what we're talking about, by omitting a crucial portion of Jefferson's point below in red. The monument says, nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free, period. Okay, then it goes on to a different, it's almost as the same paragraph. It's not the same paragraph. As an English teacher, I would say bad editing. This is what they leave out. Nor is it less certain that the two races equally free cannot live in the same government. Nature, habit, opinion has drawn indelible lines of distinction between them. That's Thomas Jefferson. This woman is the enslaved half-sister of Martha, Jefferson's, quote, legal wife. And if you want to talk about who has rights and who doesn't, so women face in many ways still a very specific loss of freedoms. So Jefferson is having relations with the half-sister of the woman to whom he is married. She is 14. She would have been 3/4 European. She came to him as an infant, part of a dowry. Gets worse. About this trade, Jefferson writes, Jefferson notes he made a significant profit every year from the birth of slave children. Quote, I allow nothing for losses by death, but on the contrary, shall presently take credit 4% per annum for their increase over and above keeping up their numbers. I'm sure folks have been checking out the interest that they're getting in money markets these days, given what stocks are doing. So here is Jefferson doing exactly the same thing. In other words, his enslaved persons were yielding Jefferson a perpetual human dividend at compound interest. 1819, some years later, worried about an increase in infant mortality among his enslaved persons, and this is long after he'd been president, Jefferson believes it was for, quote, moral as well as interested considerations that overseers should preserve slaves' lives, not, quote, for their labor, but their increase. But just to pause, anyone here who has signed a contract for a property knows the word considerations, that considerations is a polite word meaning money of some kind. So moral as well as interested considerations. All right, where is Sally's name on this list? He was very good about keeping names. 1827, 6 months after his death. Jefferson is still talking. Will be sold on the 15th of January at Monticello in the county of Albemarle, the whole of the residue of the personal estate of Thomas Jefferson, deceased, consisting of 130 valuable Negroes, stock, crop, etc., household and kitchen furniture. Draw your attention to the 130 valuable Negroes in boldface, and it's probably because he's a somewhat famous person and he's a celebrity, and so they're going to emphasize that particular one. But you notice it's simply one in a whole series of et ceteras, household and kitchen furniture. The attention of the public is earnestly invited to this property. The Negroes are believed to be the most valuable for their number ever offered at one time in the state of Virginia. 100 people were sold that day. By now, you see my practice on this one. Jefferson's social practice is different from his politics, clearly. When in 1800, there were some problems with the election, and he wrote to Madison asking how to guarantee the electoral college. Do we know where I'm going with this? We do. And Madison, who then said, you need to make sure that you have the electoral votes ascertained ahead of time. Why is it that Jefferson's son, who was born shortly after this in 1800, was named Madison? Thomas Jefferson understood where he was owed. Okay, and does that election have some history with what's been going on in the States? Yeah. So Hemmings Jefferson's descendants, Shannon Lanire, sixth great grandson of Sully Hemmings and Thomas Jefferson. He's a news broadcaster in Houston. This is what he says. I'm a descendant of President Jefferson. Take his public statues down. Sixth great grandson of President Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner. I'm a descendant through his relationship with this slave, Sally Hemmings. Despite my connection to Jefferson, he falls under the above description. There are many statues of him that should come down. He was, after all, a participant in the institution of enslavement, perhaps the most notorious one among the founding fathers, and I pause, not the only one, not least because of the jarring contrast between what he practiced and what he preached. Whew. All of this, by the way, please take a pause. Everything that we've had here has been kind of background, and I'm looking at my clock. It's about 10 to 2, and I promise to try and have folks out of here by 2:30, which will give me what? Is that about an hour? I try to keep it to an hour and a half. So
Ed, no worries. Take as long as you want.
We're now moving directly into enslavement in the federal city with the kind of background in terms of the history, which was important and you needed to know. Stateless people in the United States. The Emporium of Slavery, that's what the District of Columbia was called internationally. Samuel Boswell would say, you know what, well, why is it whenever liberty is called out most loudly, it's called out, quote, by the drivers of Negroes? And he's talking about the post-revolution US. 36, the House passes a resolution that automatic tables or postpones action on all petitions related to slavery. Stricter versions of this gag rule passed in succeeding Congresses. Okay, quote, all petitions, memorials, resolutions, propositions, papers relating in any way or to any extent whatsoever for the subject of enslavement or the abolition of slavery shall, without being either printed or referred, be laid on the tabled, and no further action whatever shall be had of them. John Quincy Adams would start off the term every Congress, am I still gagged? He did this as long as every year for the last 3 years, they tried to pass a law for the Senate in terms of apologies. So here you would see Hail Columbia, capital of the United States, the home of the oppressed. And the home of the oppressed, of course, refers to, quote, that unsingable song by the man who, Francis Scott Key. Unsingable song was the newspaper comment by it. Slave dealers operated throughout the district, including a slave house of Joseph W. Neal and Co., located on 7th Street at independence. So take a moment and think about where you are. The Hirshhorn was on one quarter, and across the street heading south would be the slaver house, which you can see from the Constitution or see from the Capitol. District did not place significant restrictions on slaves or places. 3 blocks from where Barack Obama takes the oath, there's once the St. Charles Hotel, a popular accommodation on Pennsylvania Avenue at 6th, before emancipation ruined business for slave traders. It proudly advertised it down below its first-rate restaurant. By the way, this is not 6th, this is 3rd. Guests could avail themselves of 6 30-foot-long arched cells replete with wall rings and shackles. The management promised, in case of escape, full value for the Negroes will be paid. If you are standing at the Capitol parking lot, if you turn north, that corner is where this building stood. President Obama would see this from where he stood. We're not going to have time here to move with Georgetown. I'll do a few here. Human remains found during construction of Residence Hall. We'll talk about that. These are the deceased and dead still in and around Georgetown University. Okay. Slave pit on O Street. This particular building, the rocks and stones, you can still see it behind in the CVS on Wisconsin. Andrew Stevens in the New York Statesman says, somehow I could not leave it there. Who were these people? How did they get into my house? He was doing reconstructions in his house. And then the question is, there were 5 all-Black churches flourishing in Georgetown, but fewer than 10 Black inhabitants left in the current population of 4,800. And his question is where'd they all go? What happened? This is what happened during the 30s and 40s. The disposition of the Negro residents of Georgetown, the Conference on Better Housing Among the Negroes reports, is, quote, jointly managed by the city's leading realtors and their allied banks and trust companies. Sometime, by the way, pick up the Fannie Mae real estate mortgage handbook. Potomac Street, own nomenclature, Hungry Hill, Paradise Flats. This is where many of the enslaved persons, when they escaped, they would live here. We know this building here, Dean and DeLuca. Following in 1795, from the back of the building, and this is where my walking tour usually starts, from the back of the building, you could see the tunnel all the way down to the river. In 1865, an attempt to rescrub its history, that building was replaced with this one. Okay. Again, Georgetown, quote, the Beatty auction house. This is his ad. Persons wishing to dispose of Negroes from 10 to 25 years of age, both sexes, can obtain the cash for them by applying to the subscriber 2 doors east of the Union Tavern stage office, Bridge Street, what we now know as M Street, Georgetown. Again, one wonders what kind of culture. Beatty slave auction block, which is now this, which is where they're beginning to find remains being, I won't say dug up, I'm trying to think of a proper word, sorry. Georgetown College, the map on the other side is from Roosevelt Island. And Roosevelt Island during the Civil War was the place where, unfortunately, contraband of Black soldiers and Blacks, the only place that Lincoln could keep the Black Union soldiers safe because of white resistance was on what we now call Roosevelt Island, which was at the time called Barbados Island. So you can figure. Georgetown University, 1789, same year that we went into their Constitution was passed. A photograph of one of 272 slaves sold in 1838. Thomas F. Milletti of Georgetown, by the way, he's the Jesuit, not Jesuit because they weren't titled that at the time because they couldn't by Maryland law. He was one of the Roman Catholic gentlemen of America, but he was a priest. He was a president of Georgetown, violating Catholic law about selling these. Know all men by these presidents that I, Thomas F. Moletti of Georgetown, District of Columbia, have bargained and sold by these presidents, do bargain and sell and deliver unto Henry Johnson of the parish of St. James, state of Louisiana, the following Negroes. If you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, she points out just how much more terrible it is to be sold south, the expression that we use all the particular time. Georgetown has, once its history became clear to what Georgetown, the current Georgetown administration, they have been, students as well as faculty and administration have been going, I won't say beyond what they should be doing for recompense, but they're doing their work. Healy Hall, iconic Georgetown, is named after a Black man. No one's going to tell you this. Okay. No one's going to tell you this, but it's true. Reverend Patrick Healy, he was called the Spaniard in his day because his mother was Black and his father Irish. He was the first Black president of a major university. Georgetown calls him the first Black president. There was not another. The Black Code, Washington, D.C., 1848. After the hour 5 a.m., bathe in the Potomac or Rock Creek shall be publicly whipped. If any slave shall fly a kite or kites, such offender may be punished by whipping. Any Black person watching a cockfight can be punished up to 39 lashes. If any free Negro or mulatto person living in this town, there again to the point of, if one went to Virginia and read, Googled the 1705 race law in Virginia, one finds that any person with any mix of non-white blood shall be considered real estate. And they list them: Negro, Mestizo, Mulatto, Indian. Again, this is specific Georgetown. We're racing through it. This is not the point of today's talk. I do one on these, but the federal district. And I should point out, let me point out about this, is that Georgetown was Maryland law. The federal district was the District of Columbia. So when enslavement was ended in 1862, 1850, in the District of Columbia, the slavers simply moved over to Maryland, i.e. Georgetown. That's something they're not going to tell you either. 1860 C&O Canal, built by enslaved persons, and starting from here all the way through down to around, you can see it here. There's a building on 17th Street, the old stone cabin. So this was built. It's no longer visible now because it became basically a place of stagnation and they had to refix it. The original Washington Canal opened, was built by enslaved persons. So you're seeing the Capitol, we're over here. You'll see where the Washington Monument is. In 1902, we don't have time for that story, all of this was rebuilt. This is all that remains of this. The unbuilt Washington Monument. When Washington was initially designed, the land known as East and West Potomac Park was a tidal wetland. This is an 1863 photograph taken from the Smithsonian Castle. The first part of this was built by enslaved persons. The second part is built by public help, actually. It was completed in 1885. George Washington, his enslaved persons built this. Decatur House, parts of Georgetown, the descendants of his enslaved persons built that. This is now C Street or Constitution. This would have been Independence. This is where the canal would have gone down to the waterfront. It's completed in 2 phases, as we've just talked about. It's safe to say that any public building in the District of Columbia, including this building and this building and this building, before 1860, were built with the help of enslaved persons. In the construction of the Smithsonian, the ancestry of the workers is important. Many enslaved men usually labored at the Maryland quarry from which all the buildings, quote, freestone or sandstone blocks were obtained. This property related to the holdings of Martha Washington, which itself is also interesting because we critique a present political person for having family invested in, hard to say it this way, but his own kind of business employment. George and Martha were not much different in that they are still quarrying product in property related to Martha Washington to build this particular building. You won't find that marked on the Smithsonian, by the way. Okay. In 1848, 77 women and children successfully attempt the largest escape from Washington, D.C. It's important here to understand that if you go into D.C. and you walk down the street and you see Pearl Street, which is right on the waterfront, the harbor, if you turn from where the Hirshhorn is and walk strictly south, the harbor is not far from particularly there. And the question is that we'll talk about the DC, oh, well, our enslavement was bad and we just used them for servants and yada, yada, yada. It was bad enough that 77 persons and families, the largest in the nation's history, tried to escape. This is Washington, D.C. When the slaves and crew were brought back to Washington, they were held at the Blue Jug, the infamous three-story jail and slave pen built around 1840, the site where the National Building Museum is now located. This was the Blue Jug that I talked about earlier, that when slavers wanted more enslaved persons and they didn't have them, they would go to the Blue Jug and simply take prisoners. And again, Alexandria, these are the Edmund sisters located on 1707 Duke Street. Here you can see some of the history in 1852, the Women's Conference. You see Frederick Douglass, who became the Marshal of Washington, D.C. in 1879, who escaped himself, self-manumitted, after teaching himself to read and to write, and actually reads and writes better than many people, I would guess. But he was smarter than the people who came to try and talk him down. He was basically freed, not because legally freed, because British civilians sent the money to free him. These were not Americans. I'm sorry. You see the sisters after their freedom was bought. You see the sisters here. Women of this kind would have been called fancy women. And I'll leave that to your own estimation. The Blue Jug DC prison, where enslaved citizens were taken and from which arrested men were forced into enslavement. Very quickly, the Capitol, slave auction pens, Washington, D.C., Center Market, President's House, Lafayette Park, unmarked here, but Lafayette Park, Lafayette Square was one of the most important. You can still find the Decatur House right here. Downstairs, it's a museum, and you can still find the slaver pens, the slaver pens. Lafayette Park was both an auction. It was a graveyard. It was a place where President Trump walked to do his. He was doing some kind of thing over the church. But before that particular mark, this was a place where it was legendary that you could look out the house of the White House, what they call the People's House, and see the traffic in enslaved persons. And why? Because the Southern landowners wanted it that way. Here you begin to see it again, a different thing. St. Charles Hotel, Roby's Slave Pattern, J.D. O'Neill House, Capitol's right here. This is across the street from the Hirshhorn. This is across the street from the White House. St. Charles Hotel, eyesight of the Capitol building. DC Central Market, central destination for slavers, the People's House, presidential lives and businesses. This statue of Andrew Jackson, quote, the Indian killer, was in fact built by an enslaved person, constructed. The area over to the east, north, was a cemetery. I won't call it a cemetery, basically a dumping ground. 150 years before Trump cleared Lafayette Square to walk to St. John's, enslaved people were kept in slave pens along Independence Avenue. Yeah. Lafayette Square, Andrew Jackson Square, the White House, Freedman Savings, Rogers House, Taylor House, Dolly Madison's house, St. John's Church, weddings, civil rights, Daniel Webster, Paul Jennings, Decatur, members of John Gatsby's enslaved household, etc. These are slaver or slaver-owned properties. This is downtown Washington. 12 years a slave. Free Black citizens were themselves often at risk of being picked up off the street, kidnapped, as Solomon Northup was. The kidnapping case, narrative of the seizure and recovery of Solomon Northup. They say recovery, but this was after 12 years. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law. Northup was kidnapped off the streets of DC, enslaved for 12 years under the authority of the US Constitution and the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, which says that anyone is deputized to return to the owners of the property. This law is also in the Constitution. The US Constitution says this is the slaver's justification. No person held to service or labor. And by the way, does this sound like Downton Abbey? They assiduously avoid using the word slavery or enslavement. John Quincy Adams actually gets an anti-slavery case passed because he says it's not in the Constitution. So he gets men, he gets a shipload of persons free because of that. The amity. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation, be discharged from some service, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. This differs than British law, and this is one of the reasons, as a matter of fact, that's here, and the British law of Somerset in 1773 was one of the reasons that put lit a fire under the Southern slavers, that they needed to separate from Britain. Again, 12 years he writes this. This is the building in what they call the Freedom Prison right at the moment, the Freedom Museum in Virginia. Again, the map we used before, very close to the district's line, just to be safe. You see the Capitol in the background. You see probably, how do we say it politely, people who are dressed up rather than not, because very often they would have been naked. Roby slave pen, but this is for public consumption. In 1835, in what is now Independence Avenue and 7th Street, across, it's the FAA, across from the Hirshhorn, Roby slave pen. One of the very few markers in DC, and obviously one of my particular points of political advocacy here is when we leave here, write Mayor Bauer, write somebody and say more should be noted. 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law. Attention, colored people of Boston, man kidnapped, Faneuil Hall. Again, we don't have, again, this is, Faneuil Hall, remember, is Boston. This is not the South. Stampede of slaves, a tale of horror, U.S. Marshal, coroner's inquest, writ of habeas corpus taken out, great excitement. This is Cincinnati. So you have Cincinnati, you have Boston, you have another Boston here. This is not simply the South issue. So to remember, we're coming to an end of this particular part. Remember that when this part went back to Virginia, it goes back to Virginia precisely because Virginia's economy depends on enslavement. It depended upon the sale of product that were people. These persons had no particular right, and this particular sale passes on after sheriff's sale of free Negroes, 1861. Oh, they could do that? They did. I'll proceed to sell at public auction in front of the courthouse door. By the way, in front of the courthouse door, when you start studying monuments of the Confederacy and you wonder where they're put in front of courthouse doors. Is this just by chance. I will sell at public auction in front of the courthouse door for cash all free Negroes who have failed to pay their tax in the years 1850 and 1860. Okay, I would call the attention of persons who engage in putting up fish to this sale. Oh, all right. This is February 25th, 1861. DC, just an aside here, DC, the Congress in DC, when the Southern Congress people walked out at the secession of the South, the Congress was then had the votes to pass a compensated End Emancipation Act in the district, because Congress controls the law of the district. It did. April 16th, 1862, an act for the release of certain persons held to service or labor in the District of Columbia. This was Congress. This was not Abraham Lincoln's, which started the next year. But this particular law gave compensation, not to the enslaved person, but to the people who owned them. This is what they received: $500, $1,000, $1,000, $500, $500. Seen that one before. During the Civil War, estimated 40,000 to 50,000 enslaved African Americans, Black Americans, fled from Virginia and Maryland. This is, you see them crossing the Rappahannock River. We think of immigration crises in other countries. We do not think about them in our own particular country necessarily. This is one of them. General Benjamin Butler's what to do with these persons who basically would show up and say, we're here. I mean, they're so used to depending upon, I'm sorry to put it this way, so much to depending upon the white authority. They show up. Originally, they were sent back. Then Butler, the general, says, no, we're not sending them back. This is enemy property, which they will be using against us. So that was his way around freeing them. Lincoln did not think he had the justification as president, according to Congress, the Constitution, to free them. He eventually changed his mind on that. So they were called contraband. If you go into DC, there are a couple of areas that you can find contraband camps. And you see this area here. They turned the Lee estate, Trader Lee, who, by the way, had a warrant for his particular arrest for treason. They turned his estate into a refugee freedmen's village. Sojourner Truth meets with Lincoln over the plight of the slaves. What Lincoln knew and when, because Lincoln changed his mind. If you read early on in Lincoln's policies about separation of the races and who can marry whom and what he wants, and he's very much a very conventional person of his time. He moves to a point of equality and freedom, but that's only under duress, and it takes Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and a few other people to help him get there. But so you can see where he lived in Soldiers' Home up in the area of the northern DC from the White House. The contraband camps would have been here about U Street and 10th, 12th, and 11th Street. So he would have passed and he would have seen these. So Douglass invited to the speaking of this installation in 1876, by the way, this installation, which was paid for by Black Americans, not white, said that the memorial statue, quote, showed the Negro on his knee when a more manly attitude would have been indicative of freedom. Leave it to Mr. Douglass to have his opinions on this. And he had more opinions than that, which makes interesting reading. He did not suffer fools, and he did not have much interest in Lincoln. He came to respect him. And both came back and forth. The ex-slave is depicted on one knee, about to stand up with one fist clenched, shirtless, and broken shackles at the president's feet. Douglass wasn't having that. After the murder of George Floyd, this was put up around the statue also to keep it safe. There's a copy of this, by the way, in Boston that was taken down. All right, very quickly, it's 2:20, and let me move quickly through All right, we've seen some of this. Again, here's the Hirshhorn, the slaver pen is across the street. We've seen this particular image, Mr. Obama. And from where he is standing over here would have been the St. Charles Hotel. Down this way would have been the slaver pen we've been just talking about. He would see that. The area underneath him, 300 or 400 craftsperson, Black American craftspeople, because I'm sorry to put it again this particular way, it was the Black craftsmen who built the building, not the white people who basically paid for the thing. So the western balcony, where he took the oath of office, is located at the tent city. You see it in the foreground, the Black builders of the US Capitol. The Capitol before being burnt by the British in 1814, and ask why the British burnt it, because the US had gone up into Canada. The US has tried 4 times to take over Canada. Did you know that? That's very interesting. But the first time they did it, the British retaliated. Capitol under reconstruction under an 1856 fire. Why are these images important? Because all the rebuilding is done by Black Americans. March 4th, 1861. This is what it was like when Lincoln took his oath of office. National Archives, pay stubs of slaves used to build the US Capitol and White House. They were paid. They didn't get their money. This man here was the only person who figured out how to get this particular statue on top of the Capitol. He would never be permitted, was never permitted in the building to actually see it. He died a free man, 39-year-old enslaved person. Slave labor commemorative marker, a rock in the Capitol. 212. You might say, how about an apology maybe? But this is what counts as reparations. Okay, the White House was built by slaves. There's a depressing but hopeful story. It's absolutely the truth. From the construction side of the White House, enslaved laborers were forced to witness around them the trading and selling of other slaves. The White House, People's House, was erected by slaves in the midst of a slave bazaar. Prior to January 6th of a couple of years ago, this was the only other time that the Capitol was under attack. Michelle Obama. It's the story that I witness every single day. When I wake up in a house that was built by slaves and I watch my daughters, 2 beautiful Black young women, head off to school, waving goodbye to their father, the President of the United States. Michelle Obama, commencement address, City College in New York, June 2016. One of the earliest photographs of the White House, 1846. President Polk's first year in office, he brought enslaved persons with him into the White House. And he was the one who instigated the US-Mexican War because the South was needing a way to expand their slave right territories. Judge Tawney, Supreme Court Judge, majority opinion, 1857. Quote, the Negro for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. I could read you more from that, but I suggest that if you have not read the Dred Scott decision in 1857, it's eye-opening and mandatory reading, and it reminds us that as the title of the book is, I think, unequal by any law, the Supreme Court decisions have not always been useful ones. So ending, who were these men and women and children who lived and labored in this place? What happened to them? The National Mall sits on the former site of what we've been talking about, sits on the site of the most bustling slave center, auctions and markets. Its redesign in 1902 was motivated, I'm thinking, in part, to submerge the racial history of the Capitol. It would erase any evidence of enslavement in the same way that the histories of the district were scrubbed, prettified, and touristed. And all to do this, all you have to do is Google, let's say, DC tourism, and there's a 72-page PDF that you can get that mentions enslavement once. You can Google Wikipedia, you can look up Britannica, and you look up the District of Columbia. You will not find any mention of enslavement. But that was the point of this place. The current Senate debates about DC statehood and HR 40, Task Force on Reparations, continues the political apartheid that has governed the nation unspoken since early 1700. In the DC region, at least 5 black burial grounds have been moved or bulldozed to make way for commercial development. Who knows this? Are there any signs? If you get off the metro at the Rhode Island Metro near the mall there, that's one of them. That used the whole area until a decade ago was a black cemetery. There's a Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery, one of the largest African-American burial grounds in the city, now a park in Adams Morgan. This house here. The historic site of the Moses Cemetery in Bethesda was paved over to make rooms for a parking lot. Story told across America. Forgotten black grave sites rediscovered. And the point I want to make here is, we'll get to that particular point. This is Adams Morgan, the park, where we take our dogs to run. Woodrow Wilson Bridge, unmarked. Freedman Cemetery to the left of dirt area in the lower corner. No names, no dates. Wilson, an unapologetic supremacist, segregated Washington, D.C.'s federal offices within 2 months when he became president. His bridge bodies were removed for that. Back to my friend Jefferson. We don't know where Sally Hemings was buried. Do you think we would know this fact? Nope, we don't. The only reason we know her is because of gender privilege as we know it, because she was attached to a man. I'm not saying that's correct, but as a matter of fact, would you call Jefferson master-in-law, father-in-law? She's not a concubine, she's not a mistress. What is she? It's very hard to sort out. And again, this is our culture. This is the culture that we have. But the names of these enslaved persons that we're talking about here, they're not found in places of reference or memory. Even in the Holyrood Cemetery over in the Catholic Church in Georgetown, and the Catholic Church is one of the few places that didn't segregate its people out. Was one of the few places in DC that you could bury a black person. There are no names there. But where do we find their names? We find their names, again, with Jefferson, in mortgages, in insurance. We find their names in bills of sale, bills of ladings. A list of persons who are employed to build the Capitol and White House between 1870, 1795, 1800. 122 names, simply labeled Negro hire. When someone says to you that DC is the center of African-American cultural history, I won't tell you to remain silent, but think carefully about how to answer that particular question, because it's exactly whitewash. Following the news of Reverend Martin Luther King's assassination on the 4th of April in 1968, long simmering racial tensions exploded throughout Washington, 7th Street and O Street. You can still go there and see that area. This is the land of the free and the home of the brave. And there's a whole section of photographs here that I'm simply not showing. But when they talk about the unsegregated Washington, D.C. and how good Washington is to its black citizens, no. Okay, these are all restricted. The non-white population is over here. While much of segregation in the United States was state enforced, it was already significantly ingrained within culture and society. The story map mapping segregation in Washington shows the history of what was known as racially restricted covenants. President Kennedy purchased a home in Georgetown and signed a segregated certificate on the property in 1957. At that time, DC, Washington was 54% Black. Georgetown, Black people made up only 9% of the population, was a white community and a Black city. During any time between 1930, it was a Black population. Not always the case. Just decades before, the neighborhood had a different complexion. In 1930, Georgetown was 30% Black. Why do you think there's a metro that does not go to Georgetown? Even earlier in 1880, 5,000 African Americans or Black Americans lived in the neighborhood. Many of them were former slaves. So we begin with district markers. We're going to end with a different kind of social marker. We don't have a great deal of talk, and we hear again, oh, well, but my servants really liked being servants, and they took care of my family, and kind of the chestnut, we took care of your people, we babysat your kids, and you wonder why what Frank Frederick Douglass had was not having any part of this. At Mount Zion Cemetery, enslaved people fleeing Virginia would have paused the night at the Mount Zion. Again, the question back to the Pearl and the 77 persons, if DC enslavement was also fine and so careful and we took care of everybody, and it's carrying me back to old Virginia, why were so many people trying to run away and escape? Washington was not a destination, but a thoroughfare for the Underground Railroad, that as millions of many Black American citizens were taken against their will, men, women, and children, usually unclothed or in very little clothing, and always chained by the neck and by the feet in a coffle, either on trains or walking through the District of Columbia. And what did the white people do? In 1935, 36, they had the first white on Black riots because, again, the usual thing that you can think of was, they were quote uppity persons, and so white designed violence on a whole area down near K Street. So my question here is, this is a woman who spent her life helping people to escape freedom. People who had a price tag on their head of money, and we think it's a good idea to put a picture on a bill. No, I do not think so. That's my opinion. But so the sundown towns, whites only after dark. By the way, that image is a Connecticut image. Don't let the sun set on you. Understand? We hear about this, and do we ever stop and think about it? That there are certain laws in place to this day that still keep people, and you can say, well, the laws aren't really practiced. Yes, if in Virginia, you need to go and sign up as a clergy person if you're marrying somebody, because you need to sign the court that you have seen the bride and you have seen the groom. And we sign it and we pass on. We don't pay attention to what the law is. The law is to prevent miscegenation. They can't say it, but they can do it. Brentwood, Chevy Chase, Greenbelt, Mount Rainier, University Park. Names sound familiar? Sundown towns around the District of Columbia. Japs keep moving. Wir wollen keine Judensen. Whites only. Juden. Wunderschönes Land in unserer Zeit. We don't have any market, any corner on the market of exclusion. We have no particular market on how the badness of this particular cultural shadow is not simply ours. We participate in it, and we are doing our work here this afternoon by at least alerting ourselves to the fact that words are the power, that we need to say them, that if we're going to say the names of persons who have been killed, we need also to establish the laws that made these things possible. John Punch, an African man renamed by his master, brought to Virginia as an indentured servant. In 1836, he was with two other European Americans. They escaped from their master in Virginia. They were eventually brought back. The two European, again Irish, the two Irish, quote, indentured servants were given 3 additional years to their 7-year term, which is a biblical term, 7 years of indenture. The Black man, probably African, renamed John Punch, he was given in vita durante. This is the first time in Virginia law that the expression slaved for life appears. 1636. In 1705, the VA slave code then defines white as a legal line to citizenship. So to understand, back to my particular phrase before, is that the U.S., both from colonies and then to its states, was kind of making stuff up as it went along. It had no history in any of this, and it's so if all the states have different regulations around this, and the states did borrow ready-made legal enslavement policies from the Barbados and from the Caribbean, because there it had already been done and been in practice for lots of years. But Virginia was having to kind of borrow from these islands. But Mr. Punch has a surprising descendant. This one here. President Obama descends from the first African enslaved for life in America. Not from his father, from his white mother, Catherine Dunham. That's DNA. Okay, Robert, give me about 3 minutes and we'll be finishing up here.
Ed, take your time.
Just to remind ourselves that Bowling versus Sharp was one of the 5 cases in the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that gave the states till 1967 to desegregate their schools. If we are Virginia or Virginia residents or Virginia knowledge, we know what Virginia did in 67. They simply closed their schools. But this is the District of Washington. High Court bans school segregation 9-0. Decision grants time to comply in 1967. You see McCarthy again. You see the newspaper. So you see the time. Bowling versus Sharp. The Bowling case began in 1949 when a group of African-American parents from the Anacostia neighborhood sought to have, again, Anacostia would have been the Maryland law, sought to have their children admitted to the soon-to-be-opened John Philip Sousa Junior High. The school board denied the petition, despite having empty classroom space, opened Sousa as an all-white segregated school. Washington, D.C., the home of Black American cultural whatever. Segregated by law. This is on the corner of Rhode Island and 7th. Taxation without representation. President Clinton's parting commentary, I love it. 200 years later, DC residents still exist as stateless persons, Black and white, and along that spectrum. DC statehood, a story of racism, taxation without representation, and the GOP. Blocking DC statehood should not just be treated as a purely democratic outrage, but rather as an attempt to suppress Black and Hispanic voices. Do we hear the echoes of this in our contemporary news? It lies not just on a level above the racial voter suppression of the Southern and other states, and we need to call it out for what it is. One police in the recent trial for DC, January 6, 2020, about DC. This is the only plantation in the nation that has taxation without representation. Interesting. In 1957, William Buckley argued why the South must prevail. White Americans are entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail politically and culturally, anywhere that they are outnumbered because they are part of the advanced race. And by the way, just last year, Rhode Island dropped the plantation of from its legal title. Did we know this? James Madison, who won Jefferson in an election and who was named his son. There was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature attending an immediate choice by the people. The right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the North than the Southern states. Okay, a euphemism again. The latter could have no influence in the election on the score of the Negroes. The substitution of electors obviated this difficulty and seemed on the whole to be liable to fewer objections. you'll see the 538 most recently talked about the closing up the electoral college. Washington Family Coat of Arms. DC flies a flag with Washington's coat of arms on it. The design, 3 stars over 2 horizontal red bars on a white field, has been used since 1938 as the basis for the coat of arms and the flag for the District of Columbia. It's also found on the Purple Heart. Anyone with more than a modicum of reading about Mr. Washington would understand that there were some things to think about here. And is this the kind of representation that we, the citizens of the DC of Columbia, want? I end with my friend William Faulkner. The past is never dead. It's not even past. Everything that we have talked about today comes out of a history, back to the license plate, to the buildings, to the places, to even the buildings that you still see here, even to the shape of the district. Oklahoma, it's still reservation. Do we care? Does anything happen for it? Push to remove racist names, draw support. So where do you start with? New York, which is the Duke of York, who branded as enslaved persons, brought 90,000 of them into Washington, into New York, and turned it into the stock market. Charlotte, King Charles, the other King Charles. In 1970, the Black population peaked at over 540,000 people, 71% of the city's population. By then, white residents had moved to the suburbs of Maryland and Virginia, or they could vote. In 1800, Blacks were 25% of the population. Majority were still enslaved. The consequences of that are still evident. And the recent Congress passed a vote that said, the Democratic Senate, that passed a vote passing DC Lives Matter as the state of Washington, Douglas Commonwealth. This will never get passed, but it should. Audre Lorde, Sister Outsider, Essays and Speeches, an important book. Your silence will not protect you. I want to thank you for being part of the solution, and thank you for your patience. And any errors here are my own, but I'm looking forward to the day where I live in Washington, the Douglas Commonwealth.
Oh, Edward.
One second. I want to tell you one thing.
Oh, sure.
This is in the DC tourism. Do you think that in this DC tourism online, anything is mentioned of this? No. This is, however, the token picture that they're using. This is an image of the Statue of Liberty. I wanted you to notice her feet. This is not a statue celebrating immigration. It was never a statue meant about people coming in on boats. Give me you're tired and you're homeless. This was about, it was a gift from a French abolitionist to the United States celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation. This woman has chains on her feet. Robert, I'm all yours.
Bravo, Ed. That was outstanding as always. So if you were not here for the first part of the program, this is Ed's 3rd annual presentation on enslavement in Washington, D.C. And I wanted to share a few pictures. Hold on for one moment.
I'm sorry, I went a little bit longer.
Oh, no, that's okay, Edward. No problem at all. So if you get a chance, Edward periodically in warmer weather months does in-person tours in Washington, D.C. And I wanted to show you some pictures from last year. So I think this was in April, if I'm not mistaken. It was a little chilly out this particular day. And this is actually the Dean and DeLuca site that Edward was referring to, if you're familiar with the Georgetown area.
This is Mother's Day, I think. Was May 8th?
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. It was actually early May. And so Edward will be starting these back up in person in, I think, the first weekend of April we've been talking about. Is that correct?
We talked about, yes, one with Martin Luther King.
And so, of course, we'll post those on our calendar when we get a little bit closer. And so if you're living in the Washington, D.C. area, you're going to be visiting, come check that out.
Hey, Robert, hold that right there.
Sure.
back.
This picture right here.
Go back again. Go back to the one.
Okay. Hold on 1 second. Okay.
No, one, go back. There we go. Okay. As you look, I'm sorry, folks. If you look down, you can see the river. So between this particular building, we're sitting on the right side of it. Underneath,
yeah, right down here is the Potomac.
The enslaved quarter underneath the base of Dina DeLuca, with a tunnel under the canal into the river and the harbor there. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, really amazing. And yeah, so this is closer to the river.
So this is the Georgetown. I should clarify. This is the Georgetown walk, which is different than the walk we did today.
And when people think of Georgetown, they think of shopping and cupcakes and restaurants and all that kind of, the university, of course.
Oh, smart hat. That's me. Okay. Now, this is all built again by enslaved persons. This is the canal.
Sorry, I went too fast.
It's all right. Again, this is Georgetown specific, and I really raced over the Georgetown material today because I just couldn't do justice even to the federal if I did that.
Yeah, this was such a great tour. It was real behind the scenes, off the beaten path kind of tour. And there's Edward.
It's like, good hat.
Edward, you're always very well dressed and dapper.
Thank you, sir. But remember, today's is the Ukraine flag. Okay, this is the downtown, near the area of downtown Washington, Georgetown.
Yeah, where all the shopping and restaurants and
actually, I would say this is one of the smaller numbers. It was so cold that day.
Yeah, it was very chilly this day. You can tell by people wearing. So as Edward mentioned, this was Mother's Day weekend in May, and it was really cold this particular day. Still had a great turnout.
All right, you can see the history of the rock on the road. Sorry, cobblestones.
Right here.
As I said to folks, I don't like to use the word tour. I think of them more as, this is one of the earlier ones. I think this was on Emancipation Day.
Yeah, last June. Yeah, Juneteenth Day. Yeah.
This is, I don't prefer to call them tours because they're not tour. When the George Washington's enslaved built the building behind us. Here I'm wearing my orange hat so people know who I am. But these aren't really tours. We're trying not to be voyeuristic about this. So I try to think of them as processions, perhaps. If one is Catholic, one can call them stations, one can call them places of memory. I did one for the National Gallery of Art. We called it a procession. So they're not really tours. That's my own sense.
Okay, no, that's no problem. If anyone has any questions or for Edward, feel free to share those in the chat and the Q&A, and Patty and I will try and handle those. Hi, Patty, are you out there?
Yes, I am. And Ed, we've had several people request, either they didn't get to take down the books you mentioned, but a reading list beyond 1619 Project, which I think right now is kind of considered the gold standard, but I'm not positive.
I will say this, all one has to do, and I will do this, Robert, you and I had talked about you uploading the bibliography. If one looks up American Indian enslavement and colonies, just for starts, okay, I'm actually up in Provincetown this next month doing a public presentation in Provincetown about Indigenous Americans. And it's astonishing what people, it's astonishing what we don't know and what has been erased. Until World War II, there was pretty much some evidence of Indigenous enslavement. But in the whole new wave of American studies narratives and, you know, the Marshall Plan and the victorious over the war, the reshaping of American history essentially eliminated. So then we had the new story of the Plymouth and the Thanksgiving, and it erased the reason for the indigenous and the American transatlantic, which went from Rhode Island. Who knew that 60% of American and actually 80% of American marine sales from 1860 were to the Caribbean for enslavement up until 1860. But so if you Googled any one of these, you can find this particular material. I can give Robert some books on that. Look up, just Google California genocide. Look up the missions. There's a whole other slavery. It's called The Other Slavery, which is a very good book to pick up on. And I think it is purposely, in Virginia, for example, where when you register birth, you register as black or white. For example, I did it here today, one particular point, talking about black or white. But we need to rethink, I need to rethink that particular kind of perspective, because probably most of us actually sitting right here with us are neither one nor the other, but someplace in between.
Edward, do you think in our lifetime people in Washington, D.C. will get the right to vote?
I see.
Predict?
Well, we do have it. I mean, the 1961. But I saw someone's note come up on the 69. Yes, the 1619 project refers to in 1619 of a ship that brought in. I won't quote what they brought in, but already in 1609 and 1610, John Smith and his people had already enslaved indigenous persons, Powhatans, already. So, and I understand what the New York Times project is doing, but there are other sides of this particular narrative that need to be read too.
Yeah, I've been stricken throughout this presentation, the number of, you know, quite mature people who are saying that they have never been exposed to any of this history, which it kind of floors me even, but yeah, a lot of people just don't know a lot of these things, and there's a lot of pressure to not have people know these things, I think, and that's the saddest part.
Well, any one of these.
Hey, let me interrupt you. So just FYI, these were pictures from last May when I presented Edward with a award for doing so much for our organization. It was paid for by the donations that we received from people. So this is Edward on the left, here's me on the right, and then here is the award we've given Edward, because he's done numerous programs for our organization, and we wanted to give a shout out. So I want to give you a second thanks, Edward, for all your assistance to our organization and educating all of us.
Anything, this material, any part of this material can be found with a moderate amount of digging. But for example, one of the things I talked about, DC printed material about DC itself is scandalous in what it leaves out. And they can say, well, we didn't have the room, blah, 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 blah. The 72-page PDF for DC tourism mentions slavery. That's the word they used twice.
I was surprised there was actually one question that asked what were the chief roots of the slave trade, and again, growing up in the greater Boston area, I kind of always knew about the Golden Triangle, but yeah, you're the product of where you grew up. And you know, when I was growing up and being educated, I think Boston was, or the greater Boston was, sort of rather imprudently proud of its non-slave tradition, and abolitionist tradition. And yeah, you didn't have to go very far or work very hard to scratch a little beneath the surface and learn so much of this.
Peter Finial, for example, was the first slaver out of Boston in 1841.
Yeah.
Sorry, 1641, after John Winthrop, the first governor, and who came over in the Mayflower, who did the text that all of us take in class towards Christian charity. We don't know that Tituba, for example, who was condemned as a witch, she was an enslaved person owned by the pastor from the Barbados. Just small stuff.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that has always been the obstacle, because even as a much younger person, I would get upset with, because there was always a lot of immigration into New England because early on it was an industrial center. But people that would say, oh, well, slavery isn't my fault because my mother or grandmother immigrated in such and such a time, because there is not that grasp and appreciation for the fact that, well, why did people want to immigrate here? Because of the economic bounty that was actually built on slave labor.
I see Del Price has sent a note to Del Price, Miss Price or Mr. Price. There's a wonderful image in 1967 of a white guy with the kind of a spear with a flag on it, chasing a black man across the street. So I agree with your post.
He was actually stabbed in the stomach.
Oh, sorry.
Right on City Hall Plaza.
Thank you for teaching me.
Oh, no. I mean, I just remember it. It was kind of horrifying at the time.
Someone asked how they can find out about the in-person tours. They'll be posted on our Eventbrite and Meetup calendars as soon as we finalize the detail. And of course, the name of our organization is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. This program is also being recorded for our YouTube channel, which is also Washington, D.C. History and Culture, as well as that's where a number of Ed's other talks on a wide variety of topics, including history and culture and the environment and et cetera, are residing.
I will say that I'm doing an in-person walk for American University of this particular area, the Federal District, on April 22nd.
Is it open to the public?
I'm hoping that by that time, Robert, you and I will have gotten together and we'll be doing more for us in April. But it is open, sure, it's open to the public, and but I want to push Robert and us to get our calendars together, because there's a Georgetown one, there's one for Dr. Martin Luther King, there's one for the Federal District. So there's lots of stuff to happen.
Okay, terrific.
Yeah, somebody
I'll call you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be waiting.
Somebody dropped something in the Q&A, and I'm hoping it's sarcastic, because to me, this is somewhat the obstacle. North good, South not, pretty simple history. No, it's not that simple at all, I think. And you've made that point numerous times, Ed.
Yeah, I don't know. And I want to just, you just look at the Mellon Foundation that gave us the gift for the DC Museum of Art. And basically it was, as he said to Roosevelt, the president said to Mr. Mellon, this will not change the verdict on your tax evasion trial, but thank you for the money. Anyway, but again, this is history for those who want to go find it.
Right, because another person said, and this is actually a wonderful thing to do. A lot of it was done during the Depression. Some of the programs that Roosevelt put out there for cultural development, but talk to Black elders. There is cultural memory in our people. Get to know your neighbors. Yeah,
that's true. That's true. I do a number of talks in Maryland. As a matter of fact, I have people come up to me. One person came up last week and said, I had lunch with Dr. King, and I had another person. But so you're right. In other words, I am learning my particular history from people who actually have lived here for 70 to 80 years.
Yeah. Oh, the person clarified. No, she was being sarcastic. You got to remember that rule. Sarcasm doesn't fly on the internet.
I want to thank everyone for being here. And as I said, any errors are my own. The attempts to do the work are important. We're all like the Statue of Liberty. We wear chains on our feet. We just don't always know what they're for.
Ed, do you think Washington, D.C. will get the right to vote in our lifetime?
Well, we have the
right. Had to guess.
Right to vote. We have the right to vote.
Well, you know what I mean. The presidential elections, stuff like
that. Whether we will be able to have statehood in any kind of way, I would hope so. Certainly, we're pretty close.
What needs to happen? I don't mean technically, but I know you're saying close, and it's constantly talked about. But what are the obstacles, and who is putting up the obstacles?
Right now, Republican Congress.
That's what I thought.
Passed by the Senate, it was passed by the Democratic Senate, but now it would have to be passed by the House and then go to the president.
Yeah, I mean, even going back to enslaved times, our country there's always been, I think, two groups on one side, not just Republicans and Democrats, but just usually there's two groups in the political spectrum, and the history has always been one group will allow one people to vote if some other group will allow equal number of people, some other,
Yeah, and
like the slave states and the free states coming into the union.
If you started calculating the number of states right now, right this very minute, that have laws either in process for doing something around voting, it's probably a good healthy majority. And so all of the language, whether it's Arizona, whether it's Georgia, whether it's Wisconsin, DC is not alone in. One would ask, why does this stuff matter to people? But as a matter of fact, we have I have a whole different series on white supremacy. We won't get started there, but there is a kind of power. There are two cultures we have here, and the don't say culture. Simply because we silence something does not make it go away. So when I say that cultures, we live in the shadows and gravities of this stuff, and we need to know it.
Mm-hmm. And a great deal of this whole movement, trying to discredit elections and all that sort of thing, and alleging fraud, has definitely to do with that fear of non-white people voting. And the rhetoric is designed to create certain images, whether consciously or unconsciously, I think.
No disagreement.
It's hard when you're hearing something on the fly or in the moment to really dissect a lot of the language that's being used and the coding.
We don't, Patty, to use an example that I use I've walked up and down these streets since in 86, and unless you give somebody permission to say, it's like the example I used on the environment and the animals. For years I had a cowhide on my floor. And I looked at my husband and I said, why is this here? We don't know what we know. We don't know what we're looking at. We look at the buildings in DC. We don't pay any attention, but there are markers, for example, in Georgetown about a Turkish poet. Should the marker be there? Of course. Are there any markers about Georgetown's enslaved history? No. So my only point is, let's put the words to work. Say the names, say the laws. We can go to we have a mayor who's doing her work to do this particular thing. She might be in the pay of the corporations, and I understand her need to do that particular thing. But she stood up to one president, and she can stand up. They do have the DC Faces, which is a DC kind of facilities and architecture, looking at names. There are some names that need to go. Now, you're not going to get rid of Charlestown and Charlottesville or Montgomery. But you can at least acknowledge what these people were. And Jefferson, for example, who knows, does the memorial say, for example, that it's been edited? It does not.
Yeah, you're right.
Very true.
If I turned that in as a paper, it would be turned out period, because I was misquoting.
Very true.
It's just so much more complex than people are given an opportunity to understand for a very large percentage of our population, which is the biggest tragedy.
Hey, Robert, we have kept a lot of people here for 2 hours now. But I want to,
I said take as long as you want.
Well, I want to. The good work here is someone was being very nice about education. We do the work of taking the chains off each other and off ourselves too. And so when you see something on the street, you go, "Why is that there?" And you look at the back of the CVS and you see a different kind of rock and stone. You're looking at it, and you walk up and down Georgetown, and you wonder. You see a building that they're preserving the facade of something, but not. So the more we know about this particular city, But more importantly, the more we know about our history. And I would start with Winthrop Jordan, Black over White, white attitudes towards Black from 1514 straight on. It's breathtaking what one learns.
And yet the same cultures that devised this idea of race and value also plundered the fabulous art and cultural items from throughout Africa.
King's George, well, this is where Prince Harry, for whatever you want to say about Prince Harry and his work on the Commonwealth, I was actually surprised that King Charles took that particular name, because it's not a name to conjure with in the British Kingdom. And the British families, the East Indian in 16 what do you call it? The East Indian, what they call it, in 1606, the whole Hong Kong and the British enslavement and the colonial use of opium. There are books on the royal family and their profit from it. You go up to we talk about New England, for example, about Queen Anne. Well, no one wants to hear that, but as a matter of fact, we do have a history that could use some work. Just learning about it.
Well, you had a great slide up at one point too that pointed out the three things that we do over and over again as in history. It discriminated against people of color, Jews, and Asians. And look at how there are now states that are passing laws forbidding Asians from owning property.
That started in California in 1850.
That's what I'm saying, repeating history.
This is not new. And this is why I say about, there's been a lot of talk about, anti-Asian prejudice. We are not paying attention to our history if we think this is new.
Exactly. And the reason I thought of that or remembered that was because you pointed out Hong Kong and India, which are Asian countries. So yes, we have done that over and over and over again. And as Del is pointing out, yeah, repeating history. Even though we know that if you don't learn from history, you repeat it. Apparently, we like the benefits of repeating history. I don't know. Other people pay the price.
Mr. Trump and Mr. Eastman had read their history with Mr. Jefferson and were intending on repeating it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's. I mean, when I read this, and I could not believe that there are states right now passing legislation that another group is excluded. It just seems so insane to me.
All right, well, with that, why don't we wrap things up? Ed, thanks so much for joining us. Patty, thanks so much for assisting with the discussion. As you always do, an awesome job.
Oh, thank you all.
And again, I'll email out the link for the recording. So if you've been following us, we record several of our programs and put them on YouTube, but I've been working extremely long hours at my job, which I love, but it's been very hectic the past several weeks. So I'm behind on posting the YouTube recordings for not just Edward's programs, but some few others, but I'll post those as soon as I can, hopefully the next few days. And I'll also email out the link with the recording and some additional information.
We have
Thanks,
mixed
Patty.
feelings.
Thanks, Edward.
Oh, we have mixed feelings, Robert. I think most of us are happy that you're returning to more normalcy, but we miss you deeply.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your weekend. Stay safe. See you next time.
On this President's Weekend, take it all with a grain of salt. Okay.
Excellent. Thanks, Edward. Bravo.
Good afternoon. Bye.
Bye. Look forward to seeing you again, Ed. Thank you so much.
Always.